Welcome everyone to another observability lab. This is part 2 of us talking about access management and access control. If you remember the first session, I did it with Florian. He talked about how to go vertically deep, so defining, starting with a default user access and going all the way down to policies and boundaries. That was a great session. And now we're talking about going wide or horizontal. And for this, I have Jon with me. Jon, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Great being here. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
Hey, Jon, this whole thing was actually triggered by some of the content that you have created. You prepared a blog post about managing Dynatrace access control on an enterprise scale with Terraform. Then we bounced back and forth, and then we ended up creating 2 videos, the fundamental piece that Florian did, and now we're going more like how to scale observability.
Correct.
And just as I did with Florian, please, you explain the concepts that we need to understand. Feel free to ask questions back to me or allow me to ask questions, because it's a super important topic, especially as organizations need to properly scale access control for their observability data. But now the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, so I'm going to follow up on what you covered already on session 1, which, as you mentioned, was a vertical look into permissions at Dynatrace, and turn it around a little bit once you have a clear vision and view of those permissions, how to scale those horizontally. Many of our organizations, large organizations, they operate in a modern, dynamic, multi-cloud environment. They monitor thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, on apps or services or infrastructure, and they have thousands of dispersed teams, sometimes geographically. You can imagine from a central admin team that managing permissions at such a scale manually can become an administrative nightmare, almost like a quicksand sometimes. So that's why in today's talk, we're going to talk about how we can automate and scale out and get all the benefits of doing that when it comes to permission access control at Dynatrace. Just a quick overview on the agenda. So we're going to clearly define the problem facing many organizations today, offer some of the automation options available to us, and hopefully choose one and highlight the general shift towards permissions as code. Why would you consider that? And then a little bit more focus on one of the options available, which is Terraform, industry standard when it comes to infrastructure/configuration as code. And finally, we're going to wrap up with some final best practices.
Cool.
So in terms of defining the scopes, what many organizations face today, and not necessarily just with Dynatrace, but generally speaking, IT organizations, when it comes to permissions, is that the larger they get, managing those permissions may become a bottleneck. So just to highlight a few key points here. So often, if you have multi-environments that you're maintaining, you may end up, if you're doing everything manually, you may end up in what we call a permission drift, where your dev and your testing and your production environment might look completely different because multiple administrators might have worked with those. Unless that's what you want to do, typically, you might want to repeat that configuration across your environments. It may become an audit burden if you're doing everything manually, so ClickOps, as we say, because it's tough to manually track who did what, when, what was changed, who has access to what. So you can imagine it becomes a nightmare from a compliance check as well. Very important from a security perspective. Often you might end up in situations where, due to time pressure, the central admin team might be pressured to actually grant permissions fast, which may lead to over-provisioning. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it's a risk that you need to factor in, which eventually, if it happens, it would violate the principle of least privilege, which is something that most IT organizations should implement. Finally, if you're doing everything manually, obviously through the UI, you might introduce slow onboarding for your teams. And often you have teams that need quick ad hoc access, and you want to standardize and automate as much as possible.
I think for me, quickly, because thank you so much. I always learn so much in these sessions. The security risk is a great example. And as you said, if people are, scaling their infrastructure and it takes them, they use ClickOps, as you called it, to then configure everything correctly, that time between the auto scaling to the ClickOps is being finished is a potential attack factor.
Yeah.
And then,
I don't want to sound like I'm giving a complete negative view into managing permissions through the UI, through account management portal. There are cases like that, depending on the scale and how many teams you have. It's probably fine to do that. But there comes a point, and as we talk today, we're going to discover some fantastic benefits to doing things like this. Let's look at, because we do everything else as code. We write, obviously, applications and services, and we represent infrastructure as code. So why not also represent security and permissions as code? What are the options that we mentioned earlier? Well, the obvious choice it's certainly to just hit the API directly. We have a Dynatrace account management API under api.dynatrace.com. Choose your language of choice, and you can certainly go pedal to the metal, bare bones, access all the functionality that we offer, whatever the UI offers, and maybe some more. There are cases you may consider that. I'm not going to say no. You have strong developers, you know what you're doing, fine. The second option, which is widely adopted in the industry, is to consider configuration as code. We have our own homegrown Monaco, which is built and targets specifically Dynatrace as a provider, or many organizations, they choose Terraform as kind of an industry accepted provider, which we build our own Terraform provider, but also that same Terraform can target other platforms as well, even within the same code, if that's what you want to do. So you can, in theory, you can deploy also your resources in the cloud as well as part of managing Dynatrace.
Yeah, and I think, this is great that we followed kind of that trend. As you said, a lot of organizations have invested a lot of time in building their own Terraform practices, their plugins, and it's great that they can then just use the same language, because why introduce yet another language to configure one of the aspects of software delivery, which is observability, with a different tool, if we can do it in the same tool? Yeah, correct. I really like it.
So there's tons of knowledge that comes with it, which certainly you can reuse it. Very briefly on the benefits of automation through configuration as code. By the way, I should have mentioned in the previous slide. So we're going to focus slightly more on the Terraform story. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to also give a sample, a working sample with Terraform. But just very quickly on the benefits of such automation with configuration as code. So certainly there's two pillars or categories. One is operational. I'll quickly go through this. Please interrupt me if you have any questions, Andy. From the operational perspective, certainly you're introducing standardized deployment. So by consistently coding all your permissions, you can deploy it identically, if that's what you want, across your various environments. Certainly, it comes with scalability. So you can deploy permissions for hundreds, if not thousands of teams in a standard way, in a controlled way. If you go one step further, and many organizations are already there with anything else they build, is you can put this as part of your Git workflows. Then all of a sudden you're introducing version control, traceability, auditability, which are all great also for your compliance. And by doing this kind of automation, you kind of eliminate the manual clicks, not taking away the UI completely. There's uses for it, obviously, but you eliminate sometimes even email requests. So you can imagine users sending emails or opening tickets to the central account team. From a security side and government side of things, first point, I mean, all of the points are important here, but first point quite important. You can kind of codify a least privilege access control. Through implementing Git, you also introduce your CI/CD pipelining. You can do your integration, continuous integration, and continuous delivery. Whatever your underlying system is, GitHub or GitLab or Jenkins or what have you. The third point, very important and often gets missed. By bringing things into code and also bringing it into Git, workflows, you're making your developer community to be stakeholders when it comes to permissions, because they're the ones that are coding those configuration changes. Yes, it goes through an approval process, but they're part of that workflow. So it's very important. And if you take all of this as a whole, you're improving your compliance and you're improving your governance.
There's one thing I wanted to add here, and I mean, these are all perfectly valid points. Another benefit that I see, because I see more and more people using observability earlier in the software development lifecycle. So ideally, right, you start in development, go into your testing environment, all the way into production. That means you have the ability here to also validate that your observability configuration works as expected before it hits production, because what if you make a configuration mistake and all of a sudden the critical logs that you need are no longer accessible because you made a mistake in your policies? You can validate this upfront.
Yes, so, it's part of your development workflow. Yeah, good point. More specifically about the Dynatrace Terraform provider, I call it toolkit, but it's a provider which implements a number of Terraform resources which target both the Dynatrace platform, your environment resources, as well as the account management, which is also what we talk today, obviously, for access control. I just wanted to highlight the key resources that are implemented by Dynatrace Terraform provider, which also, by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, both Monaco and Terraform, you can think of those tools as wrappers around the API. So they use declarative language, but they're basically making the calls, making the hard work to actually call the backend APIs. So back to this topic here. So the Terraform provider implements the users and the groups in those resources. It does implement the policies and permissions. Remember, as you talked in the first session, policies target primarily they're meant to target the latest Dynatrace, even though it's possible within the policies to define roles, role permissions. And then there is also the Dynatrace IAM permissions, which is your classic role-based access control. Finally, what brings it all together, boundaries are further restrictions to the policies, which are repeatable components. You already talked about this. And the bindings is the final resource that actually strings everything together. Puts the policy to the group and puts the boundary to the policy, so on and so forth.
And Jon, one more thing maybe to mention, folks, if you're watching this and you are wondering, is there any more information just in general about Terraform, we will add a lot of links to the description of the video. We will add the links to videos that we have already recorded around the Terraform provider, also the link to the Terraform provider itself, to the GitHub page, the documentation. So just so you know, just check the description of the video and you will find follow-up links for all of these topics.
Awesome. Thank you. And finally, I thought I'd just show, without delving into code too much, I thought I'd just very quickly show how declarative these languages are. So with 30 lines of code, I'm able to define a new group, a new policy, in this case it's a custom policy, with a number of basic permissions, allow statements, a boundary that can potentially further restrict that policy, and then I can bind everything together, where I can say this particular group for my account ID is going to be bound to this policy with this boundary.
That's cool. I remember all of this. That it's obviously fresh on my mind because I just recently recorded the session with Stefan, where he exactly also walked through all this in the Dynatrace UI, and now it's really great to see how nicely and easy it can be declaratively managed through Terraform.
Yeah, and I mean the key point is that it's really the merging between dev and ops, because you don't really need to be a developer to understand such logic. There might be some kind of coding parameters in there, or coding pieces like for loops, etc. But it's nothing crazy. Lastly, to bring it all together, to bring it to an enterprise level, as I mentioned earlier, you want to tie all your coding into a GitOps workflow. And I just highlighted the 4 key events here. worth discussing. It may get more complicated than this, obviously, but certainly you start with your developers that write the code. They propose the changes to the configuration, to access control. They submit a pull request, which gets reviewed and accepted in step 2. And when that happens, then you can trigger your CI/CD pipeline, which is basically in charge of, and in step number 3, you can do all kinds of things, obviously. Mm-hmm. This is where you can check for coding standards, you can check for your compliance standards. So it's an opportunity to do final checks before you even fire up the deployment. And then that last step, the Terraform apply, would basically take all that configuration that you wrote in your text files and apply it, be it in the Dynatrace environments that you own, that you're targeting, or in the account management, obviously, for permissions management. It's as simple as that. Yeah. And you can, maybe one last thing here, Andy, you can imagine that you can even take this to steroids and offer self-serve for your user base.
I was just thinking about this. I've been talking a lot about platform engineering recently, and it's all about providing self-service through a portal or however that works, right? Providing templates that developers can just add to their repositories, and then it's a simple pull request, and then those changes will be applied. And I think the magic then also is in the templates that people are using and providing. But yeah, and as you correctly said, whether you're using Jenkins, whether you're using GitHub Actions, GitHub Workflows. I've also seen people using Argo and Argo Workflows. Yeah. There's different ways to push these things out, yeah. But it nicely fits into your software delivery lifecycle because observability configuration just becomes part of the package that you're delivering as you're delivering your software changes.
Correct. And with that, I wanted to introduce the audience to a sample repository, I would say production-ready sample repository that kind of captures what we discussed and also some of the best practices that you also talked in the first session of this talk series. So if that's okay, I'll quickly switch into just highlight. Okay. So basically in our official public-facing GitHub repository for configuration as code, you will find this Terraform example. I'll just start with this high-level picture here because it tells the story what is implementing. So you can imagine a customer that has multi-cloud entities being monitored with data being streamed, ingested into Dynatrace. Potentially, you can also include an open pipeline routing in the middle, as those signals are coming into the environment. Through rules, you can define to pretty much route your data into default buckets or custom specialized buckets, and even introduce filtering through segments. Once you have that infrastructure in place and data is coming in, you want to make sure that users have the right permissions to that incoming data. So we're depicting a list of teams here, which are actually implemented as groups within Dynatrace. So your typical central admin, observability, engineering, devs, and maybe even a special Morpheus team that are granted access to policies, be it default policies or custom policies, which eventually grant access to the underlying environment and environment data and resources. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know one of the things that, because you just highlighted Morpheus as one of the teams, one of the capabilities we also have, and I know this goes beyond the scope maybe of this particular conversation, but enterprise customers may say, does this mean I need to reconfigure all of my groups that I already have somewhere configured in my entity provider again in Dynatrace? Is there some option to also link those?
You don't need to reconfigure groups. As I mentioned earlier, you can leverage pretty much federation attributions to assign group memberships on the fly for your users. And I probably should have mentioned this, but certainly in Terraform, you don't need to create everything from scratch. If you have things already in place, there are code blocks. One is called resource that creates a resource. One is called data, where it can refer to an existing resource. Okay. Actually, we use this exact same concept when it comes to default policies because they already exist. You don't need to recreate them.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
So I wanted to walk you briefly, not delve too deep into code, that's not the purpose, but to walk you briefly through some key concepts when it comes to this particular sample and how it may be useful. Just get you started very quickly. So I'll switch into Visual Studio Code. So I've simply done a Git clone of the same code repository in here. Nothing special, again, about this repository. I mean, anybody familiar with Terraform will notice that we're showing the same typical suspect files that you would see. Main is where the code is implemented. Variables, if you have some variables. Provider is where you define how to connect to Dynatrace, that you want to use the Dynatrace provider and how to connect. So it's as simple as code like this. And then when it comes to configuring that provider, it needs to know, obviously, connection information, which from a security perspective, you don't hard code in code. Just as an example, you would export it as system variables. You would tell it where your environment URL is, what's your OAuth client ID and secret, and what's your account ID. Once you have that information in place, you can run a Terraform apply, and the code would connect, the provider would connect to your environment and to your account management and execute the code pretty much. But last point I wanted to make here is you also want to drive your code through configuration. You don't want to start hard coding values of your group names or your policy statements, etc., in code itself. You want to generalize that too, so that people that are making changes have only one spot where they can make them. So you can implement that as a JSON or a YAML file, which shows YAML. This is where you can define one or many buckets that you're serving, one or many segments, pipelines, individual teams and attributes for those teams, etc., etc. The policies, if the policy is existing, the code will look at this configuration and say, okay, I need to refer to an admin user policy. It's existing. I don't need to. So on and so forth. And once you have that in place, if you imagine yourself being in step 3 in that Git workflow, you would just simply be doing a Terraform apply in here. We'll wait a little bit because I want to show you very quickly. Anybody that does Terraform knows this, but Terraform apply would show a plan of all the resources it needs to deploy. And you simply say, yes, I want to deploy, and you just wait. It might take a minute or two, so maybe we stop here rather than waiting, and then we reconnect again.
Sounds good.
And we're back. The deployment has finished. I wanted to use the last remaining few minutes to just highlight some final wrap-up points, Andy. That's okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So we talked about the importance of treating permissions in Dynatrace as regular code. They contribute to enhanced security and give us the ability to implement least privilege approach. They help us scale the deployment of those permissions to thousands of teams. They improve our compliance, our auditability, and quite importantly, they bring everybody, certainly the developers, into the fold of permissions, and they become stakeholders for those permissions.
Yeah, John, thank you so much. I can only echo what you just said, right? Basically, I remember in the early days of DevOps, we talked about shift left. Now we're talking about expanding left, but making sure that engineers are also thinking about observability from the start. And that also means we need to make sure it's easy, accessible, and understandable, and the same tools can be used. This is why I can only echo so much. The collaboration aspect is a key point. Bringing those configuration changes into the IDE, as you just showed, using tools like Terraform, which are the standards out there in our industry. I want to recap again. So what I've learned over these 2 sessions, and folks, do me a favor, in case you haven't seen session number 1 with Florian, then check out the links. But we have learned how you can go from global default user groups that we specified in Dynatrace that we ship with out of the box, how we can go vertically down into very fine-grained access control using policies and boundaries. And then beyond what you just showed us is that through configuration as code, whether it's through the API, through Monaco or Terraform, how you can go broad or horizontal, how you can embed observability configuration in your software delivery lifecycle, because observability configuration needs to be treated as a component, as an attribute of a delivery, like your business critical apps. So really great stuff. Links, as I said, and also thank you so much for that GitHub repository. I mean, that's really great as a starting point. Any final words from you?
No, thank you for having me. This was fun. I hope it was useful. So
definitely, I learned a lot. I mean, I've never claimed that I'm an expert in access control. I don't want to claim I'm an expert now, but I know much more, and that's the most important thing.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.